questions for Scott? Yeah.
You make the point at the beginning that almost from the outset, he had a colonial intent in terms of like identifying
Yep.
products and so forth, and their profit value and so forth. So, given the fact that that was his intent and he knew what he was doing, how do you decide whether the scientific racism that he was employing was conscious or unconscious?
Well, I would actually say that he didn't think he was doing colonialism. He went to South America thinking, I'm just going to write down what I see, and I'm just going to see the animals, and I'm just going to write down what I know about the indigenous people, and here are the facts, and I'm going to just present it. And when he did that, he ended up writing about all these preconceived notions that he had, and he ended up looking for products that were useful because that's the movement that he was participating in. But he didn't go there with the intention of doing scientific racism in some way, or he didn't go there with the intention of finding evidence to support this theory, but it ended up being supported in what he wrote. So what we kind of take away from that is you think you go someplace and you think you're objective, but you bring all of your various cultures and your thoughts and your preconceived notions with him, and Azara did that too. So, does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Was his view of the native peoples as kind of one-sided, as you, it's a short piece of it that you made it seem, I mean, is he more ambivalent or ambiguous? Is he admiring in some ways?
Yeah, I'm actually really glad you asked that, because I didn't have time to present the very last part of my thesis is on limitations to his colonialism. And one of the things he does in this section that has 2 pages about the indigenous animals, he presents a 1-paragraph counter-argument. And he says, well, the indigenous, when they have children with Europeans, have fertile offspring. And the indigenous are completely identical in terms of physical anatomy to Europeans. And when they are put into institutions or something like this, they can do everything that Europeans do. They can do art, they can do music, once they're taught. And then at the end of that paragraph, he says, but you know, I haven't subscribed to what some biologists have said, that if you make fertile offspring, then you're the same species. So he kind of writes it off at the end. So what I concluded by that is saying that, yes, there were some limitations that science forced him to ask questions. But what he did when he came to places where, to us, it seems really natural to make the leap into saying, well, if they're humans, then they are in unjust conditions. For us, it seems really natural, but for him, he didn't ever make that leap. He kind of gets there and stops. And to me, that indicated that he was actually, the preconceived notions were so ingrained in his brain that he couldn't make the leap. So instead, he kind of reconciles it with what his own beliefs were. So it takes him there, but he has to stop short. So that's how I answer that. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you took into consideration the audience that he's writing for in creating this, and maybe that's one of the reasons he wasn't willing to go forward, because he knew the audience might not accept that.
Yes, I talked about that a lot in the travel writing section. The way that he's doing this is that his brother was a really influential ambassador in Paris. So we kind of think about Spain as being really dogmatic, and they didn't have as much science, and that was true to some extent, but not really. I talk about that in my paper as well. But he was writing not for Spain in this case. He was writing a lot for Paris. So yes, I think that his audience definitely shaped it, but also, we talked about the history of travel writing. That was also really a big thing for him, because he thought that he was making an encyclopedia. So he's saying, here are the facts, here are the facts, here are the facts, here are the facts, here are the facts. And then here's the argument for, and here's the argument against. So he thinks he's doing all this stuff. And that's intended for an intellectual audience in Europe. So that definitely would have shaped how he presented the argument. He's trying to do it very rationally. He's trying to correct a lot of mistakes that previous travel writers have done. So, does that answer the question?
I was just thinking that, historians are already judging what's happening now in the field of medical anthropology, in which you have the scientists going down and living with indigenous people in the Amazon or Central America, trying to discover new medicines and practices that these indigenous people, and not only have they taken from there, but they have patented, these medicines, and then they ask, well, how can you patent something that was actually discovered by indigenous people? And he says, well, they're not using them effectively, right? They're not capitalists, they're not using them for the benefit of humankind, so that's how, how they rationalize that they can take that information from indigenous people and then not sharing any profits with them, so.
It's the same idea.
Right.
We're still looking for, and it's hard to argue that that's a bad thing, in that the benefits for society are going to be great. If they have a medicine that cures HIV or something, how could we need that to be marketed to people who need that? But at the same time, you're right. It's not. It's the same thing 200 years later.
Was he Catholic, or how?
Yes, he was Catholic. He was from the upper class. His brother was a very influential person. He was in the military, which is how he ended up being in the Rio de la Plata region.
How does he reconcile, being Catholic and then being a product of the Enlightenment and being scientific? Did he ever see that as being a conflict, or?
He did not, but it was kind of interesting because you have to think too that this is the time before Darwin. So the theory of evolution wasn't around yet. So he presents an alternative to how all the species are connected. And what he said, based on the evidence that he had, was that rather than having two of everything being created by God, God must have done it kind of in orders, different orders. So like the plants had to come first so that they could cover the whole planet first. And then the smaller beings would come next, like ants and stuff, so they could spread out. And then he would introduce the big predators so that they would have stuff to eat, because the world's already been populated. And you can see throughout his work how there's that, he's wrestling with that question. And at the same time, as someone who knows enough about evolution to just be like, you're so close, you're so close. I want you to figure it out, but he never quite gets it. But he was an important influence on Darwin. He's repeated, or Darwin talks about him fairly frequently in The Origin of the Species, and he uses a lot of the evidence that Azara kind of says, well, look at this is kind of weird. What's that? And then Darwin figures it out and then uses that to support what he has.
Do the colonial authorities ever quote or use his work to legitimize their own colonial policies against indigenous people?
I believe that they did. He was using science all the time. He was interacting with different Spanish people. So I'm trying to think of a good example of a time where I saw that. I would say that more you see it in the way that he's referencing different people in his work. He says a lot. He'll name people specifically if they're Spanish. So you can see that they're having really intense conversations about. There's one time where he talks about the nitty-gritty of plants with this priest at one of the churches. So you can assume that they're sharing a lot of this kind of debate about what is important and what isn't. So although there's not a lot of evidence in the works that I examined of people benefiting from what he says, you can kind of infer from the fact that he was doing all this kind of science alongside other Spaniards, that he was able to share ideas with them in that kind of way. Yeah.
So, given in your in the presentation, you said that the Spaniards were trying to assimilate, or based on his research, he was trying to assimilate the indigenous people into he write anything about like enslavement of them, or like of how they, more like how they should be
He
treated?
wrote so much about that, and it took me a long time to read and really figure out what to do with it. And what he says is that, so there were two different ways of, at this point, enslavement, kind of. It was known as the encomienda system, we talked about it in our Latin America. The encomienda system was that they would take Indian natives and they would do labor. In return, they would be taught Christianity and they would be taught civilization. Now, there were two different methods of this. One was an ecclesiastical kind of way, where the church was running it and it was kind of state-funded because the church and the state were basically the same thing. And the other one was a private way. Now, when we look back, we say, well, the religious way was really a lot better. They had better conditions. It preserved their culture better. But what Azara does is he's arguing on behalf of the private encomienda system. And he says that the religious ones don't work. We should have it be secular because in that we've seen better benefits, in that they've converted them more into Europeans, which is kind of an interesting take on that. Today we think, this is kind of going off what Sam says, how memory changes, right? Today we think that the religious one was better because it preserved their culture, but back then he thought that the secular version was better because it got better results. So it's kind of an interesting debate. Did that answer your question?
Time for one more question, I think we have one over here.
Yeah, you've been talking about how his so-called facts that he's gathered has been jaded by his own perspectives, his background, and whatever. Have you thought about the idea that you studying this as a person coming from a Western culture, do you think your results are different from someone else studying the same topic currently from his own culture, or someone in Europe or somewhere else?
I would definitely think that my results would be different. It depends, especially if you're going to come at it as kind of like post-colonialist. That's a term that is in the historiography of my paper reading. So there were a bunch of writers who looked at how did colonialism affect the indigenous people, basically. So that's kind of how I came at my paper, with this post-colonialist idea. But if you come at it with a different type of historiography in mind, you're going to have big differences in